The document sat between us on the glass coffee table, entirely too thick to be a simple bank transfer form. My father, Ronald, reached for it with tanned, weathered hands, his eyes flicking toward the new gold wedding band on my left ring finger. Our small townhouse in Midlothian smelled like Judith's heavy floral perfume, a cloying scent that completely overpowered the dark roast coffee I had just brewed. She always wore that perfume when she wanted something from me. "Family comes first," Ronald said, his tone carrying that familiar heavy expectation. He assumed I was handing over my $50,000 military retention bonus. He assumed I would fix their problems, just like I always had. He flipped the cover page and I watched his thumb slide down the thick paper until it stopped abruptly on the word defendants. Below that header sat 3 specific names: his name, my mother's name, and Emily, my younger sister. The muscles in Ronald's jaw locked tight. The paper trembled just slightly in his grip, producing a dry, rasping sound against the glass table. "What did you do, Samantha?" Judith asked. Her voice cracked, losing its practiced, church-going sweetness. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling the cool, solid metal of my ring. I just put the truth in the right file. To understand why my own family was sitting in my living room holding a civil complaint, we have to go back exactly 3 months. We have to go back to the morning of my wedding. The historic Riverside Mill venue in Chesterfield County always smelled like damp brick and old pine wood. I stood in the center of the main hall, listening to the harsh scrape of wooden chairs being dragged across the floor by the setup crew. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching the dust motes in the air. My venue coordinator, Grace, approached me, holding her clipboard tight against her chest. She refused to meet my eyes. "We have a problem," Grace said, her voice dropping to a nervous whisper. I asked her what was missing from the delivery. "Everything," she replied. She explained that there was no cake, no floral arrangements, no custom arch, and no photo booth. I looked over her shoulder at the delivery dashboard on her tablet. According to the morning schedule she had pulled up, there was not a single Everly Events delivery truck heading toward our venue by the Appomattox River. I did not scream. I did not throw anything. At 38 years old, managing complex logistics and global supply chains for the Army as a chief warrant officer for missing cargo was my daily language. I automatically assumed a truck had broken down on the highway or a dispatcher had entered the wrong zip code into their navigation system. Pulling out my phone, I dialed Everly Events. A representative named Kelsey answered the line after 3 rings. I asked for the estimated time of arrival on my delivery, speaking calmly but clearly, treating the situation like a delayed shipment at the base. Kelsey paused. I heard the frantic clicking of a keyboard in the background. "Ma'am, that order was delivered an hour ago, exactly, according to the updated event worksheet." I gripped the edge of a nearby wooden reception table, feeling a sharp splinter catch against my palm. I told her I never sent an updated worksheet to their office. "The client-authorized change was approved by your secondary logistics contact," Kelsey explained. "Judith Warren." My mother. The name hung in the damp air between us. A cold pressure built behind my ribs, expanding until it pushed the breath out of my lungs. 6 months ago, knowing I had a long training deployment, I had added Judith as a secondary contact just for basic coordination. I did not argue with the representative on the phone. I simply asked Kelsey to confirm the exact delivery address and the precise time of drop-off. She read off the address of a high-end country club in West Chesterfield. Daniel found me a minute later. My soon-to-be husband taught high school history, which meant he possessed an incredible ability to read a room and de-escalate chaos before it erupted. He did not tell me he would fix it. He did not offer empty promises about making things perfect. He stood beside me, looked around the empty brick hall, and asked a simple question. "Do we pause, or do we get married today?" Daniel asked. My eyes found the front doors. My retired Army buddies were already arriving in their dark suits. Daniel's fellow teachers stood chatting near the entrance, holding small wrapped gifts. Our neighbors were taking their seats in the folding chairs. These were the people who showed up for us consistently, without requiring a performance. Reaching into my bag, I pulled out my Bluefield notebook. I carefully wrote down Kelsey's name, the time of our phone call, and the country club address. Then I closed the sturdy cover and slid it back into my pocket. "We get married," I said. Our chosen family sprang into action the moment they heard the news. My friends drove to a local supermarket and bought every white rose and baby's breath bundle they could find, stuffing them into borrowed glass jars to line the aisle. The venue staff rolled out backup speakers and hooked up a phone for music. One of my former squad leaders pulled out his camera to take professional photos. I only broke down once. 10 minutes before the ceremony began, I locked myself in the bridal suite bathroom. I gripped the cold porcelain sink and stared at my reflection in the mirror, trying to force air into my tight chest. They had chosen her again. Even today, they had pushed me aside. But then Daniel knocked on the door, his voice steady and warm through the heavy wood. "I am marrying you," Daniel said. "I am not marrying a floral arch or a 4-tier cake. Take your time, Samantha." I washed my face, opened the door, and walked down the aisle alone. I did not want anyone stepping in to give me away as a consolation prize. There were 2 empty chairs in the front row where my parents should have been sitting. Emily was absent as well. I kept my eyes focused entirely on Daniel, reciting my vows without mentioning the people who had abandoned me. An hour after the ceremony, while our guests were eating a makeshift dinner catered by a local restaurant, my maid of honor tapped my shoulder. She handed me her phone, her expression a tight mix of pity and absolute disgust. "You need to see what Emily just posted," she whispered. My sister's real 30th birthday was not supposed to happen until the following weekend. We had locked in my wedding date 8 months ago, ensuring everyone knew the schedule. But Judith and Ronald had quietly moved Emily's celebration up to coincide with my weekend, bringing all the extended family together under one roof. Now, staring at the screen, I understood exactly why they had changed the date. Emily was posing in a designer dress on the manicured lawn of the country club. Behind her stood the exact custom floral arch I had chosen with Daniel 6 months ago. The elaborate tiered cake sitting on the dessert table matched my chosen color palette perfectly. But instead of our names, the elegant frosting letters spelled out a different message. It read, E30. I looked closer at the bottom left corner of the photo. Stuck to the wooden base of the floral arch was a torn delivery sticker that someone had forgotten to peel away. I could clearly read the bold black numbers of my Everly Events contract code. "Take a screenshot of everything before she deletes it," I told my friend. I took the phone back for one last look, zooming in on a wooden welcome sign placed near the cake table. The front had been painted over with Emily's name in bright gold lettering, but on the back edge, barely visible where the fresh paint ended, were 2 small initials carved into the wood, S and D. They had not skipped my wedding for Emily's birthday. They had taken my wedding with them. An hour later, while our guests were eating a makeshift dinner catered by a local restaurant, I stepped into the quiet hallway near the coat room to check my phone. A saved voicemail from Judith waited in my inbox, left earlier that morning while I was getting dressed. I pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the audio. "You are a soldier," my mother said, her tone bright and entirely unbothered. "You can handle it. Emily only turns 30 once." Someone laughed loudly in the background over the heavy bass of a pop song. Ice clinked against crystal glass. She had left the message while standing in the middle of a party funded by my stolen wedding contract. The woman who raised me sounded incredibly proud of her own resourcefulness. My thumb hovered over the glowing screen. Instead of deleting the horrible sound, I tapped the export button, renamed the audio file with the current date, and uploaded it directly to my secured cloud storage account. The screen lit up again before I could put the device in my pocket. A text message from Ronald arrived, containing only 6 words. Do not make this ugly. He demanded peace while standing firmly on the wreckage he had helped create. A moment later, Emily sent her own message. The words dripped with practiced sweetness, ignoring reality entirely. I hope your little ceremony was beautiful. My jaw ached from grinding my teeth, yet my fingers remained perfectly steady on the smooth glass screen. I did not type out a long paragraph explaining my devastation, nor did I demand an apology she would never give. I simply asked her one direct question. Did you know where the Everly Events package came from? I waited in the dim hallway, watching the screen glow in the shadows. The small gray text changed to read. My sister saw the question, understood exactly what I was asking, and offered nothing but silence in return. The drive back to Midlothian that night felt longer than usual. We parked in the driveway of the townhouse Daniel and I had purchased together, a narrow brick building that represented the physical boundary line of my adult life. I dropped my keys onto the granite kitchen counter, listening to the heavy metallic clatter echo through the quiet space. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the cedar wood from the living room furniture. We possessed a joint mortgage, a fully funded 6-month emergency account, and a locked steel filing cabinet in the corner of the office containing my updated beneficiary forms. For years, my parents expected me to absorb their crises without complaint. When Emily wanted to attend a specialized design program 2 years ago, I paid the tuition directly to the registrar so the money could not be diverted to her shopping habits. When Ronald required major back surgery, I burned 3 weeks of military leave to change his bandages and help him walk down the hallway of their house. I provided support because I decided to offer it, never because I owed them my life. Standing in my own kitchen, looking at the life I had built with my own hands, I realized my capacity for suffering was not a license for them to use me. Sitting on one of the kitchen bar stools, I opened my laptop and created a new digital folder on the desktop. I dragged the original Everly Events contract into the empty space, followed by the invoice, the saved voicemail, and the screenshots my maid of honor had captured of Emily posing beneath my wedding arch. Daniel walked into the kitchen, setting a steaming mug of chamomile tea next to my keyboard. The warmth radiated against my wrist. He leaned over my shoulder, looking at the files gathering on the screen, then pointed toward the front door. He reminded me that the security camera mounted on our porch automatically retained footage for 30 days. Taking a sip of the hot tea, I opened the security application on my phone and upgraded our subscription to save video indefinitely. Judith possessed an established habit of showing up unannounced at my front door whenever she needed to spin a new version of reality, and I intended to capture every single word she said. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I pulled up the zoomed-in photo of the floral arch from the country club birthday post, staring at the torn delivery sticker stuck to the wooden base. The sequence of numbers printed in bold black ink matched my invoice perfectly. They had not just taken the decorations. They had taken the exact items tied to my financial obligation. My phone vibrated against the granite counter, buzzing loudly enough to make me jump. Grace, the venue coordinator, was calling. After the reception ended and the vendors finally packed up their equipment, she had found a moment to sit in her office and listen to the messages left on the venue answering machine. Grace spoke quickly, her breath catching slightly as she processed the information she had just discovered. A delivery driver had called the mill very early that morning. The man was confused because the address listed on his updated daily worksheet did not match the Riverside location printed on his original cargo manifest. He had left a message asking for clarification before leaving the warehouse. I asked Grace to write a formal, neutral statement documenting exactly what failed to arrive, the timeline of her discoveries, and the exact contents of that recorded message. She agreed immediately, but then her voice dropped to a hesitant whisper over the speaker. Grace explained that she had just spoken to the dispatch office to verify the timeline. The dispatcher checked the driver notes and found a secondary entry logged just 10 minutes after the driver left his voicemail at the mill. Someone had called the dispatch office back, redirecting the truck away from my venue and sending it straight to the country club in West Chesterfield. The caller explicitly ordered the delivery company not to contact the bride under any circumstances, claiming it was a surprise adjustment. Grace read the phone number attached to that final instruction, reciting the 10 digits slowly into my ear. I stared at the black screen of my laptop. I recognized the area code, and then I recognized the rest of the sequence. It was not Judith who made that final, decisive phone call to divert the truck. The person who blocked the driver from calling me, the person who ensured my venue would remain empty while Emily celebrated, was Ronald. Monday morning arrived with a thick layer of heavy gray clouds hanging over the Richmond skyline. The drive to the Everly Events corporate office took 45 minutes, every single second stretching out in a tense, suffocating silence. Daniel drove the car, keeping his right hand resting steadily on my knee. I spent the entire ride staring out the passenger window, my blue field notebook resting heavily in my lap. Inside that small book, I had documented Kelsey's name, the exact time of our phone call on my wedding day, and the specific address of the country club. I possessed the timeline, but now I needed the physical proof to match my notes. The corporate office was a modern glass structure surrounded by perfectly manicured hedges. A receptionist escorted us immediately to a private conference room on the second floor. The glass table felt cold under my forearms when I sat down. The room smelled strongly of stale vanilla air freshener and burnt coffee, a sickening combination that made my stomach turn. Kelsey, the account manager I had spoken to on the phone, sat across from us. She twisted a silver ring around her index finger, her eyes wide and panicked. Next to her sat the regional director of the company. He wore a sharp gray suit and possessed the overly calm, practiced demeanor of a man trained to handle angry brides. He started speaking before Daniel and I even settled completely into our chairs. The director offered a conditional corporate apology, stringing together empty phrases about miscommunication and unfortunate scheduling overlaps. He steepled his fingers, leaning forward with a look of manufactured sympathy. According to their internal digital system, he explained, the company had merely executed a client-authorized change. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an immediate refund. Reaching into my canvas bag, I pulled out my blue notebook and the original printed event contract. I slid the thick stack of stapled paper across the smooth glass table. "Show me the authorization," I requested quietly. The director pulled a manila folder from his leather briefcase. He extracted a single sheet of paper and placed it right next to my original contract. It was an updated event worksheet. My eyes scanned the printed text. The document stated that the primary client had changed her mind. The large wedding reception was canceled, replaced by a private family celebration. The delivery location had been altered to the West Chesterfield Country Club, but the most glaring detail sat at the very bottom of the page, right below the final authorization line. Someone had typed my full name into the electronic signature box. Just below that forged signature was a special instruction note printed in bold text. It read that Samantha Warren was currently away on active military duty and could not be disturbed under any circumstances. A strange, high-ringing sound started in my ears. The woman who raised me had not simply made a demanding phone call. Judith had actively impersonated me, using my service to the country as a convenient, impenetrable shield to prevent the vendor from verifying her lies. I placed my index finger firmly on the typed name. I looked directly into the eyes of the regional director. I was on a field training rotation, I told him, keeping my voice dangerously flat. I did not type this signature, and if you look at the original contract right next to your hand, you will see exactly what my mother was authorized to do. Daniel tapped the specific clause on the original page. The black ink clearly defined Judith as a secondary logistics contact. The following paragraph explicitly stated that any changes to the location, the primary purpose of the event, or the personalized design elements required written confirmation directly from the primary client. The director swallowed hard. The practiced, corporate calm melted right off his face. Kelsey stopped twisting her silver ring. The young account manager looked terrified, her breathing shallow as her eyes darted between her boss and the forged document on the table. She realized exactly what she had done. I turned my attention to her. Anger burned in my chest, hot and sharp, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. Screaming at Kelsey would not retrieve my stolen property or undo the damage. She was merely a weak link in the chain, a convenient pawn in my mother's elaborate scheme. "Who sent this worksheet to you?" I asked her. Kelsey cleared her throat twice before speaking. Her voice shook badly. She confessed that Judith had emailed the updated worksheet directly to her inbox, claiming it was a massive family emergency. Judith had begged the company to process the changes immediately to save the weekend, leaning heavily on the panic of the moment. "And who called the dispatch office?" Daniel asked, his tone completely unyielding. Tears welled up in Kelsey's eyes and spilled over her lower lashes. She admitted that a man had called the office 2 times during the week before the event. He demanded to know if the color changes had been properly applied to the cake and the floral arch. He pressured the staff to bypass standard verification protocols, loudly repeating the story about my strict military deployment. Ronald. My father had actively bullied a young coordinator into breaking company policy. We left the Everly Events building an hour later, with a copy of the forged worksheet secured in my bag. We drove straight to downtown Richmond, navigating the heavy afternoon traffic until we reached a tall brick office building. A trusted colleague at the logistics base had previously recommended a civil litigation attorney named Natalie Cross, and I had called her office the morning after the wedding to beg for a rushed appointment. Natalie sat behind a heavy, dark oak desk. She looked to be about 46 years old, wearing a crisp navy blazer and projecting an aura of absolute, unwavering competence. Her office smelled of lemon furniture polish and old paper. She listened in complete silence as I laid out the timeline: the original contract, the blue notebook, and the newly discovered forged worksheet. I explained the secondary contact clause, the delivery diversion, and the exact cost of the stolen package. When I finally finished speaking, Natalie picked up the worksheet. She studied the typed signature for a long, heavy minute. "Being betrayed by your parents is a terrible tragedy," Natalie said, setting the paper down gently. "But a feeling of betrayal does not automatically win a civil lawsuit. We are not dealing with hurt feelings here. We are dealing with property, contracts, and fraud." She leaned back in her chair and folded her hands together. Natalie explained that to build a successful legal complaint, we had to prove undeniable ownership of the package, the clear overreach of authority by my parents, their explicit knowledge of what they were doing, and the exact financial damages I suffered as a result. I nodded slowly, understanding the structured logistics of a legal battle. It was a completely different language than emotional family drama, and it was a language I knew how to speak. "From this moment forward, the rules of engagement change entirely," Natalie instructed. "You do not post anything on social media. You do not send angry text messages to your sister. You do not call your father to demand an explanation. Every single piece of communication must be in writing, and you do not threaten them with a lawsuit until we have secured every piece of evidence." Daniel squeezed my hand under the desk. He knew exactly how hard it would be for me to sit in silence while my extended family continued to wonder why the wedding had fallen apart. Allowing my parents to control the narrative for even a few weeks felt like swallowing broken glass. "I can follow the rules," I promised. Natalie pulled a fresh legal pad from her desk drawer. She told us she would immediately draft formal preservation letters. These legal demands would be sent by certified mail to both Everly Events and the West Chesterfield Country Club. The letters would legally compel both businesses to retain all portal upload logs, internal emails, recorded phone calls, delivery receipts, and security camera footage from the weekend. If either business deleted a single digital file or shredded a physical receipt after receiving the letter, they would face severe legal penalties for destroying evidence. My legal shield was officially in place. We drove back to Midlothian as the sun began to set. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple above the tree line. My mind spun with the details of the day, organizing the raw facts into clear, manageable categories. The event company held the digital portal logs. The country club held the physical delivery proof. My parents held the stolen goods. Daniel parked the car in our driveway. The brick townhouse looked exactly as we had left it, quiet and completely separate from the toxic chaos of my childhood home. We walked up the concrete path toward the front porch, the evening air feeling heavy and humid against my skin. My phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I pulled the device out and looked at the glowing screen. The security application tied to our newly upgraded doorbell camera had just triggered a motion alert. The notification indicated that the movement had been recorded just 10 minutes ago, right while we were driving home from the lawyer's office in Richmond. I opened the application, tapped the newest video file, and waited a second for the footage to buffer. The video loaded on the small screen. Judith stood on our front porch. She wore a pristine beige sweater, her hair styled perfectly, looking exactly like the respectable church-going woman she pretended to be. In her hands, she held a familiar white bakery box. It was a leftover piece of the birthday cake. She had brought me the same cake that had been baked using my wedding contract, decorated with my chosen colors, and served at my sister's stolen party. My mother possessed the absolute staggering nerve to show up at my house with a sliced piece of my own ruined wedding as a peace offering. In the silent video, Judith shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She looked down at the white cardboard box, then reached out and pressed our doorbell. She waited a full minute on the porch. When nobody answered the door, she leaned much closer to the brick wall. Her face completely filled the camera frame. She stared directly into the small glass lens. The microphone picked up her voice with crystal clarity, capturing a demanding tone that was completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "Open the door, Samantha," Judith said to the empty house. "We need to agree on what really happened before people start asking questions." I stopped walking on the path. Daniel paused beside me, looking down at the frozen image of my mother's face on my phone screen. She did not want to apologize. She wanted to synchronize our stories. She wanted to ensure the twisted version of reality she had invented would remain the Euchord the family ever heard. I locked the phone screen, walked up the front steps, and slid my key into the door. The legal preservation letters were already being drafted. The evidence was currently being locked down across 2 different corporate systems. My parents thought they could script the ending to this disaster, completely unaware that I had just hired a professional to document every single lie. We were standing in the narrow hallway of our townhouse, staring at the live audio feed on my phone screen. The woman who raised me stood directly on the other side of our heavy oak front door, holding a leftover piece of the cake she had stolen from my wedding. Judith leaned closer to the small camera lens mounted on the brick frame. Her voice filtered through the tiny speaker in my hand, carrying a demanding, impatient edge. She wanted me to open the door so we could agree on a unified story before the extended family started asking uncomfortable questions. Daniel reached for the brass deadbolt, intending to lock it tight. I caught his wrist, shaking my head slowly, and tapped the microphone icon on the security application instead. "All communication needs to go through email," I said. My voice echoed slightly from the porch speaker. Outside, Judith physically flinched. The mask of sweet, maternal concern melted away in an instant, replaced by a rigid line of absolute fury across her mouth. "You are being completely ungrateful, Samantha," she snapped at the camera, her tone turning sharp enough to cut glass. "After everything we have done to support..." I dragged my thumb across the screen, terminating the audio transmission. The porch feed went silent. A few seconds later, my phone vibrated violently against my palm, displaying an incoming call from Ronald. I answered the call, pressing the speaker button so Daniel could hear the conversation. My father did not bother offering a greeting. "If you do not come outside right now and speak to your mother, we are going to tell the extended family exactly how you are acting today. Do not make us do that." I pressed the red button, ending the call immediately, and saved both the video footage and the phone log into my encrypted digital folder. The promised retaliation arrived before I even poured my first cup of coffee the following morning. My phone buzzed relentlessly on the granite kitchen counter, signaling a flood of notifications from the large family group chat. I picked up the device, watching the messages scroll past rapidly. Judith had posted a massive block of text, crafting a masterpiece of distorted reality. She spun a narrative painting herself as a desperate peacemaker trying to manage a chaotic situation. According to her detailed message, my strict military training schedule had forced me to scale back the wedding at the very last minute. She claimed the event company had made a series of delivery errors, and because I was humiliated by my small ceremony, I was now projecting my frustration onto Emily simply because her country club birthday party had looked much more expensive. Several aunts and cousins replied with heart emojis, praising my mother for her endless patience. The absolute unfairness of those responses sat heavy in my stomach, feeling exactly like a swallowed stone. A separate notification dropped down from the top of the screen. Aunt Barbara had texted me privately, bypassing the main group chat. "I know you are under a lot of stress with the army," Barbara wrote, "but you have to let this go. Be the bigger person, apologize to your mother, and keep the family together." Daniel read the text message over my shoulder. The muscles in his jaw tightened, and he pulled his own phone from his pocket, ready to type out a fierce defense. I stopped him by placing a hand over the screen. The legal strategy outlined by Natalie Cross required absolute silence, even when the silence felt exactly like drowning. "I will speak when the records are complete," I typed back to Barbara. Then I muted the entire family thread and set the phone face down on the counter. The first piece of concrete ammunition arrived 2 days later. Natalie forwarded a secure document package from Everly Events containing the initial digital portal logs demanded by our legal preservation letter. I sat at the dining room table, opening the attached spreadsheet. The rows of black text detailed exactly when the forged event worksheet had been uploaded to the vendor system. The digital timestamp read 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday, exactly 2 weeks before the wedding weekend. Opening my heavy canvas bag, I pulled out my official military travel itinerary and cross-referenced the specific date. At that exact hour on that Thursday, I had been sitting inside a secured testing facility at the logistics base, completing a mandatory supply chain certification exam. Electronic devices were strictly prohibited inside the testing center. My phone and my laptop had been locked inside a metal storage locker 3 floors away from my desk. The portal data proved undeniably that the secondary contact account registered under Judith's personal email address had uploaded the document. It was physically impossible for me to have typed that electronic signature. Natalie had also included a secondary file in the email package. It contained the internal customer service notes typed by Kelsey, the panicked account manager. She had meticulously documented a series of highly aggressive phone calls from my father. According to the typed logs, Ronald had called the corporate office twice, absolutely refusing to let the staff speak to me directly. My older daughter changed her mind, he had told Kelsey. He then threatened to file formal complaints with the Better Business Bureau if the delivery truck dared to approach the Riverside Mill venue instead of the country club. A brief message from Natalie sat at the bottom of the email thread. The Everly Events system indicated that one of Ronald's phone calls had been automatically recorded due to a random quality assurance protocol. The corporate IT department was currently searching the system queue numbers to extract the specific audio file. We just had to wait for the system to process the request. Daniel paced across the living room rug, running a hand through his hair. The pure injustice of the smear campaign was eating at him. "We have the proof right here," Daniel argued, pointing firmly at the laptop screen. "We can take a screenshot of that timestamp, put it right next to your military training schedule, and post it in the family chat tonight. We can shut her completely down." I understood his anger perfectly, because a matching fire burned inside my own chest. But our attorney had laid out the rules of engagement for a reason, and a rushed defense would ruin the long game. "If we show them our evidence right now, they will just invent a new lie to explain it away," I explained, keeping my voice steady even though my fingers gripped the edge of the table tightly. "Judith will tell the family that I gave her verbal permission before I walked into the testing center. We have to let them lock themselves into their fake story completely before we drop the floor out from under them." Daniel stopped pacing. He looked down at me, the anger fading into genuine concern. He asked quietly if I was simply carrying the entire burden of this toxic family on my shoulders again, sacrificing my own reputation just to absorb their chaos. Closing the laptop, I let out a long, slow breath. The fear of becoming the villain in my own family history was a heavy, suffocating thing. Since childhood, I had operated as their designated crisis manager. If I stopped saving them, and if I allowed the truth to shatter their perfect public image, they would absolutely brand me as the person who destroyed the family. I had to make peace with wearing that terrible label if I ever wanted to build a peaceful life of my own. Late that evening, while heavy rain washed against the living room windows, another email notification chimed from my laptop speakers. Kelsey had apparently continued digging through the corporate event system, desperately searching for anything that would prove she was not entirely at fault for the massive failure. The young coordinator had located a separate communication thread, quietly archived under a subfolder labeled Design Changes, and forwarded the entire chain directly to Natalie. I opened the attached document, scrolling past the corporate headers. The sender of the email was not Judith, and it was certainly not Ronald. The address belonged to Emily. The subject line typed across the top of the screen read, "Final changes for E30. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Until this exact second, a small, fragile part of my mind had clung to the desperate hope that my younger sister had simply been a passive, clueless beneficiary of the theft. I had wanted to believe that our parents had orchestrated the entire diversion alone, and Emily had just blindly accepted a lavish birthday party without asking any complicated questions about where the decorations came from. I clicked the message open, my eyes scanning the text. The golden child of our family had not been innocent at all. Her very first sentence sat highlighted against the white background. "Please remove Samantha and Daniel's initials from the cake." The glowing white screen illuminated the dark kitchen, casting harsh shadows across the granite countertops. I stared at the forwarded email thread, my eyes locked on the subject line Emily had typed out herself. My younger sister had not simply arrived at a country club to find a surprise party. She had actively orchestrated the theft of my wedding. Her message detailed specific, methodical demands directed at the Everly Events design team. Emily instructed the coordinator to scrape away the vanilla frosting I had selected, demanding a bright pink alternative to match her birthday dress. She ordered the staff to reposition the dessert table to serve as a designated photo area, ensuring the stolen decorations would feature prominently in every single picture. But the final sentence secured her guilt entirely. My sister explicitly asked if the wooden wedding arch could receive a quick coat of fresh paint before the delivery truck arrived. She knew exactly what she was receiving, and she wanted the evidence disguised. A second attachment sat right below the email chain. Natalie had included a saved image file, explaining in her notes that Judith had emailed a screenshot of a private text conversation to the corporate office to prove the family approved of the sweeping changes. I clicked the image open, watching the gray and blue text bubbles fill my screen. My mother had warned Emily that the venue coordinator was asking too many questions about the sudden address change. Judith worried they might need to cancel the diversion entirely to avoid suspicion. Emily replied immediately, her blue text bubble carrying a casually brutal dismissal. "Do not send anything back," Emily wrote. "Samantha has army friends. They will figure something out." The air completely vanished from the kitchen. My own strength, the resilience I had spent nearly 2 decades building in the military, was being weaponized against me. They felt completely entitled to steal my wedding because they firmly believed I was strong enough to simply absorb the loss and survive the theft. I had spent my entire adult life protecting my younger sister, shielding her from consequence, and she had just used that exact protection to justify robbing me. Daniel placed his hand on my shoulder, his grip tight and grounding, but a cold numbness had already settled deep into my bones. The phone rang late the following afternoon, shattering the quiet atmosphere of our living room. Judith called to invite Daniel and me to a reconciliation dinner at the family house. Her tone dripped with a manufactured, gentle remorse, claiming she desperately wanted to formally apologize and fix whatever unfortunate misunderstandings had occurred over the weekend. I called our attorney immediately after disconnecting the line. Natalie advised against attending the dinner, warning that my parents were likely setting a trap. When I insisted on going to understand exactly what evidence they were afraid of, the lawyer established strict, non-negotiable boundaries. Natalie instructed me to keep my mouth shut, refuse to sign any documents, and leave the moment they tried to apply legal pressure. I agreed, knowing I needed to see their strategy firsthand. We arrived at my childhood home just as the streetlights began to flicker on, casting long shadows across the manicured front lawn. The house smelled intensely of roasted chicken and the heavy lemon wax Judith always used on the dining room table before hosting guests. We sat across from my parents and Emily, a heavy, suffocating silence stretching out over the untouched porcelain plates. Judith broke the quiet atmosphere first. She pressed a white cloth napkin to her eyes, forcing out a dramatic, trembling sob that shook her shoulders. The woman who had forged my electronic signature suddenly claimed she honestly thought I did not care about fancy decorations. She cited my military background as proof of my practical nature, spinning a story where she was simply trying to save resources because a soldier like me preferred simplicity. Ronald leaned forward, aggressively stabbing a piece of chicken with his silver fork. He loudly blamed the event company for mismanaging the delivery schedule, shouting that corporate incompetence had ruined everything. Sitting quietly at the end of the table, Emily performed her designated role perfectly. She widened her eyes, placing a manicured hand over her chest, and pretended to be completely shocked by the revelation that her lavish birthday supplies had originated from my wedding contract. I did not pull out my phone to show her the saved email. I kept my expression carefully neutral, utilizing the quiet interrogation tactics I had learned years ago at the logistics base. Instead of arguing, I asked short, simple questions, letting them talk themselves into corners while I gathered intelligence. "What exactly did the company mismanage?" I asked my father, keeping my voice soft and confused. "They got confused by the addresses," Ronald declared quickly, waving his fork in the air. He remained entirely oblivious to the recorded phone calls currently sitting securely in my attorney's digital file. Following the tense meal, Ronald pushed his empty plate aside and pulled a folded sheet of paper from his shirt pocket. He smoothed the thick document out, flat on the wooden table, tapping the top margin with a heavy finger. The page was titled, "Family Resolution Statement." My eyes scanned the dense legal paragraphs printed on the paper. The text expertly framed the entire weekend as a regrettable communication error between vendors and family members. It legally established that I had suffered absolutely zero financial damages, and it officially waived my right to pursue any future legal claims against any member of the Warren family. "Sign this, and we can all finally move forward," Ronald commanded, holding a black ink pen out across the table. I stared at the pen, tracing the gold lettering on the side, then looked back at the legal document. I asked if I could take a copy to my lawyer for a quick review before signing anything permanent. Ronald immediately scowled. He reached out to pull the document back across the table, arguing aggressively that lawyers only complicated simple family matters and ruined trust. But Judith placed a restraining hand on his arm, her rings clicking against his watch. Assuming my quiet demeanor meant I was exhausted and incredibly close to surrendering, my mother smiled softly. She nodded at me, offering a sweet, poisonous smile, and told me to take all the time I needed to feel comfortable. I folded the paper carefully, sliding it deep into my leather purse. Throughout the painful, drawn-out goodbye at the front door, I kept my shoulders slumped forward. I deliberately projected the image of a defeated, broken daughter who just wanted the exhausting conflict to end. We walked slowly out to our car, our shoes crunching against the gravel driveway under the glowing street lamp. The moment the heavy car door clicked shut, sealing us inside the quiet cabin, the manufactured exhaustion vanished completely. My posture straightened, my hands stopped trembling, and a cold, sharp focus returned to my mind. Pulling the waiver from my bag, I turned on the overhead dome light and snapped clear, high-resolution photographs of every single page. I emailed the image files directly to Natalie, before Daniel even started the engine. Daniel watched me from the driver's seat, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. He realized I had faked the hesitation entirely inside the house, using their own perception of my emotional weakness against them. My phone buzzed exactly 2 minutes later with a rapid reply from Natalie. The attorney confirmed that the waiver was a desperate, highly calculated legal maneuver. The document proved beyond a doubt that my parents anticipated a massive financial dispute. They were actively attempting to manufacture a beneficial legal admission before I realized the true, staggering cost of their theft. We drove through the dark suburban streets, the rhythmic thud of the tires rolling over the wet asphalt providing the only sound in the car. I watched the passing houses slide by the window, realizing I no longer recognized the people living in my childhood home. They were not a family looking for peace. They were simply opposing counsel looking for a cheap settlement. My phone rang sharply, the loud chime shattering the quiet atmosphere of the car. Natalie was calling, pushing past her usual strict email protocol for a direct, immediate conversation. I answered the call quickly, placing the phone on speaker so Daniel could hear. "Do not contact them tonight," Natalie instructed, her voice clipped and entirely professional. "The event company just located the physical delivery receipt from the country club. Your mother signed for the property." The physical delivery receipt rested on Natalie's mahogany desk like a death warrant. It was a crisp, standard document issued by Everly Events, and across the bottom signature line my mother had scrawled her name with arrogant, flowing loops. Beside the signature, the receipt clearly displayed the unique alphanumeric contract code I had originally signed 8 months prior to the wedding. Judith had claimed in her frantic texts that she was just helping an overwhelmed coordinator, but this single sheet of paper bridged the gap between a simple scheduling mistake and a deliberate, documented act of theft. I stared at the paper while Natalie pulled a digital tablet from her desk drawer, tapping the screen to bring up a security file provided by the country club. The video quality looked grainy, capturing the afternoon sunlight reflecting off the club's pristine golf greens. My father stood near the rear of the heavy delivery truck, arms crossed over his chest, directing the workers as they unloaded the floral arch. Judith walked alongside them, her hand hovering near the equipment as if she were inspecting it for quality. Emily trailed behind, visibly pointing toward the lawn area where she wanted the arch positioned. They were not confused or panicked. They were coordinating the installation with surgical precision. One employee from the country club had even provided a written statement, recalling my sister laughing while saying her sister had simply changed her plans for the weekend. Natalie leaned back in her high-backed chair, her expression professional and completely detached. She explained that while Everly Events had acted with gross negligence, they were currently attempting to mitigate their own liability by cooperating fully. The company had officially acknowledged that Kelsey, the account manager, lacked the authority to authorize such drastic modifications without a direct verbal confirmation from me. They offered to refund the portion of the invoice covering the missing items and pay for the emergency replacement costs we had incurred to save the wedding ceremony. "We cannot accept those funds immediately," Natalie warned, watching me closely. "If you accept a partial settlement from the event company now, you might unintentionally jeopardize your ability to claim the full extent of the damages from your parents later. We must clearly delineate the culpability of each party to avoid any claim of double recovery." My mind worked through the logistics like a complex supply chain map. The total exposure for my parents was ballooning rapidly. We had the original $28,000 package price, the $8,000 we spent on last-minute replacements, and the mounting legal fees generated by our discovery process. The combined financial pressure clearly exceeded the $50,000 military bonus they were hunting. "They are not looking for a way to fix this," I realized aloud. "They are holding out for the bonus payment." I had received an administrative notification through my military personnel portal the previous day. The $50,000 retention bonus was set to be released into my personal account at the end of the current month, contingent on the final approval of my continued service agreement. My parents clearly monitored my career milestones through the rest of the family, and they were calculating their moves based on the expected arrival of that money. They were not trying to apologize. They were waiting for the Treasury to cut a check they felt entitled to steal. A sudden, sharp, buzzing sound interrupted my thoughts. Aunt Barbara had messaged me again, her tone worried and thick with family guilt. She asked if my bonus check had hit the bank yet, mentioning that Judith was currently speaking to every relative who would listen about how Samantha finally had the resources to settle the family debt. My mother was laying the groundwork, framing me as the greedy, wealthy daughter who refused to help her own father in a time of financial crisis. I looked at Natalie, my jaw tight. The plan had shifted. My parents were no longer just holding on to a stolen wedding. They were actively weaponizing my career achievements to leverage the bonus payment. I told Natalie we needed to finalize the civil complaint immediately. The attorney opened a legal drafting program on her monitor. She began building the formal lawsuit to be filed in the Chesterfield County Court. The document carefully outlined the coordinated pattern of deception, the unauthorized use of my personal contract, and the deliberate interference with my property rights. Natalie included every piece of verified evidence we had managed to lock down: the portal logs, the delivery receipts, the security footage, and the call notes from the vendor. I sat in the uncomfortable chair, reading each paragraph as she typed. It felt strange to see my life reduced to a series of legal claims, but every sentence brought a strange sense of clarity. I refused to let her add emotional fluff or vague accusations that we could not support with hard evidence. I demanded precision. If it was not on a document or captured by a lens, we excluded it. "I am ready," I said, my voice steady. I picked up the pen and verified the final page of the complaint, signing my name with the same focus I applied to military logistics planning. Natalie promised to file the documents with the clerk of the court the following morning. I walked out of the office into the cool evening air, feeling a strange lightness in my chest. For months, I had been the one responding to their traps, but tomorrow, the legal machine would start turning, and they would be the ones forced to provide answers. My phone rang as soon as I pulled into my driveway. The caller ID displayed the home line of my parents' house. I did not take the call, but my father left a message, his tone clipped and angry. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not mention the stolen wedding. "We know the money hits on Friday," Ronald barked into the voicemail. "We will be at your house on Saturday morning to settle this properly." He expected me to stay home and wait for his arrival, prepared to hand over the money like a good, obedient daughter. I looked at the dark windows of the townhouse, then walked inside to finish the remaining tasks on my list. The process server Natalie had hired would be meeting us at the house early Saturday morning. I poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen island, and watched the digital clock on the oven. I had spent my entire life trying to be the person my parents needed me to be, but the only thing waiting for them on Saturday morning was the official stamped documentation of their own ruin. Saturday morning dawned with a piercingly clear sky, the kind of weather that made the world look sharper and colder than usual. Daniel offered to stay in the living room with me, his presence a steady, quiet anchor, but I told him I needed to handle this moment on my own. I stood in the small foyer of our townhouse, checking the doorbell camera app on my phone. The quiet of the neighborhood felt heavy, like the breathless stillness before a sudden storm. I had already warned my parents through the porch speaker that every word spoken on my property would be recorded for legal purposes, but I knew they would try to ignore the boundary regardless. A silver sedan pulled into our driveway exactly at 10 in the morning. My father exited the vehicle first, his posture rigid and his face set in a familiar, aggressive scowl. Judith followed him, looking remarkably composed in a beige cardigan, while Emily trailed behind them, her eyes darting toward the dark windows of our house. They were clearly operating on the assumption that a show of force would be enough to intimidate me into submission. They did not know that Natalie Cross had successfully filed the formal civil complaint with the Chesterfield County Court the previous afternoon. I waited until they were standing on the front porch before I unlocked the door. I did not invite them inside, choosing instead to stand in the threshold, forcing them to remain on the concrete step. I kept my posture relaxed, refusing to mirror their hostility. Ronald immediately stomped onto the rug in the foyer, his eyes scanning the room as if he were looking for a safe to break open. He did not ask how I was doing or acknowledge the home I had built. He simply held out a hand, his fingers twitching with impatient greed. "The $50,000 is family money, Samantha," he barked, his voice booming against the high ceilings of the hallway. "We have debts that need to be settled immediately. Stop playing these games and write the check." Judith stepped up beside him, her tone softening into that oily, fake sympathy that once used to make me doubt my own sanity. "We are only asking for a loan, honey. We just need you to help us until everything calms down. We are family, and we have to protect each other from this mess." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my chest. I watched their faces, looking for any shred of genuine remorse, but found only the cold calculation of people who viewed me as a resource rather than a daughter. "What exactly am I paying for?" I asked, my voice remaining entirely neutral. Ronald scoffed, throwing his hands into the air as if the question were an insult to his intelligence. "We borrowed the package for one night because Emily needed that day. You still got married, didn't you? Nothing was really lost. Just pay the money, and we can make sure Emily deletes those photos and tells the extended family that we have finally reconciled." Judith nodded enthusiastically, eager to seal the transaction. "It is the perfect solution for everyone. We can bury this, and you can come back to the family dinner next Sunday." I tilted my head, studying them. The sheer audacity of their offer, demanding I pay for the privilege of them lying to the rest of my relatives about the theft, was almost breathtaking in its simplicity. "You always told me that family comes first," I said, finally letting a trace of iron enter my tone. "Why didn't family come first on the day of my wedding?" Ronald's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He took a threatening step toward me, his voice dropping into the low, menacing register he had used to enforce his authority throughout my childhood. "Family does come first. Emily needed us more than she needed a rehearsal for your little life. You were trained to handle disappointment, Samantha. You are a soldier, so act like one, and do what you are told." I did not raise my voice, nor did I flinch. I reached behind the door and pulled out a thick, official-looking document packet stamped with the formal seal of the court clerk. I pressed the cold paper into my father's chest. Ronald looked down at the header, his expression shifting from anger to confused irritation. He assumed I was handing over a bank transfer form or a signed waiver of debt. But then his thumb slid down the page, and his eyes focused on the section labeled Defendants. The blood drained from his face as he read his own name, followed by Judith's and then Emily's. "What is this?" Judith whispered, her voice losing its practiced sweetness. "Are you really trying to sue your own family?" "I am simply documenting exactly what my family did to me," I replied. The doorbell rang at that precise second, the sound cutting through the stunned silence in the foyer. A man in a plain windbreaker stood on the porch, holding a matching packet of legal documents. He did not waste time with small talk. He looked at Ronald, then at Judith, and then stepped past them to hand the court papers to each of them. He then turned toward the driveway, walking past the open door to the silver sedan parked at the curb. Emily was sitting in the back seat, her face pressed against the glass, clearly terrified to step out into the sunlight. The process server did not hesitate. He knocked firmly on the window, waited for Emily to lower the glass, and formally delivered the legal notification into her shaking hands. My sister looked over at the front door, her eyes meeting mine for a split second. The smug, golden child mask had completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but raw, pale fear. The process server walked away, leaving the three of them standing on my porch with their lives officially falling apart in their hands. They stood there for a long moment, unable to comprehend that the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I stepped back into the hallway, pulling it out to see Natalie Cross calling from her office. "The process server confirmed the delivery," Natalie said, her voice brisk and efficient. "But you will want to hear this. Everly Events just finished their system audit. They found a recorded phone call from your father on the morning of the wedding." I leaned against the wall, watching my parents struggle to process the legal papers in their hands. "What is the first thing he said?" I asked. "He said," and I quote, "Do not call the bride," Natalie replied. I ended the call and tucked the phone away. I walked back to the doorway, looking at my parents, who were now standing in the middle of my driveway, frantically scrolling through the pages of the civil complaint. They had come here to demand a payment, to bully me into silence, and to ensure their version of the truth remained the only one in existence. Instead, they had walked directly into the start of a public, documented reckoning. I locked the front door, turned the deadbolt, and listened to the sound of their voices rising in panicked confusion outside. My part in their crisis was officially over. Natalie called my office at the logistics base 3 weeks after the papers were served, her voice crisp and energized. She had successfully retrieved the audio file from the Everly Events quality assurance queue. The file played clearly through my computer speakers. I leaned back in my chair, listening as Ronald's voice filled the small, sterile room. He was confirming the country club address, instructing the delivery staff to reroute the truck, and then came the specific, cold demand that would define the entire case. Do not call the bride. Ronald had actively silenced the one person who could have prevented the entire disaster. Hearing the audio confirmed that he knew exactly what he was doing when he sabotaged my wedding. It was not a mistake. It was an execution of a plan he had personally supervised. While I analyzed the recording, the smear campaign outside the courtroom reached its peak. Judith sent a long, carefully worded email to the extended family, claiming I was suing my own parents simply to receive a second payment for the same event, framing me as an opportunistic daughter driven by greed. Emily posted a series of vague, tearful stories on social media about toxic siblings who weaponize lawyers to punish their parents, and I started receiving anonymous, hostile messages from distant cousins who had only heard my mother's side of the story. I spent my lunch breaks sitting in my office, deleting the vitriol without ever responding. Natalie had warned me that the public accusations were designed to draw me into a messy, unmanageable fight, and I refused to give them the satisfaction of a public reaction. Instead, I carefully compiled the documentation for the limited correction packets our lawyer authorized, sending the contract terms, the delivery receipt, and the photo proof, only to the few relatives who had actually reached out to ask for the truth. My phone chimed on a Tuesday evening, startling me out of a deep focus session on my supply chain spreadsheets. Aunt Barbara was calling, her voice thick with genuine shame as she apologized for having believed Judith's original story. She had shown the correction packet to the rest of the family at the last reunion, effectively cutting off the supply of blind support my mother had relied upon. Barbara promised to serve as a witness regarding Judith's prior behavior if it ever came to that. I kept my answers short and polite, grateful for the clarity but wary of getting trapped in a long, emotional conversation about forgiveness. I was not ready to be a member of that family again, regardless of who realized the truth. The following months became a grueling cycle of written discovery, document exchanges, and depositions. I provided financial records, event invoices, military travel documents, and the timeline preserved in my blue notebook. During a 6-hour deposition, their attorney repeatedly questioned whether I had verbally approved the changes. I answered every question with the same calm precision. If an answer was supported by a record, I gave it. If I did not know, I said so. Judith's deposition took place the following week. She insisted that I had given her permission, but she could not identify when the conversation occurred, where I had been, or why she had supposedly needed to forge my electronic signature afterward. Ronald tried to place the blame entirely on Judith. Natalie then confronted him with the vendor notes, showing that he had called the dispatch office himself and ordered the staff not to contact me. Emily was questioned last. She maintained that she had been an innocent guest at a surprise party until Natalie placed the design change email in front of her. Emily read her own request to remove my initials from the cake. Her expression changed before she reached the final line. After the deposition, their attorney requested a private conference with his clients. Later that afternoon, he contacted Natalie to discuss mediation. Their 3 stories no longer supported one another, and the objective records left them little room to create a 4th. The pressure inside their small, fragile alliance finally snapped a few days after that deposition. Emily called my personal line, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and cold, calculated self-interest. She did not want to apologize. She wanted a deal. My sister demanded to know if she could be removed from the lawsuit if she handed over the full transcript of our family group chat. I reminded her that my lawyer handled all negotiations and that cooperation would not magically erase her responsibility for the theft. Emily sobbed, blaming our mother for promising her that I would never actually file the papers, but the realization that the Golden Child protection was over had clearly set in. She sent the transcripts to Natalie's office the following morning. The full group chat was a brutal map of their betrayal. Judith had started the plan 2 weeks before the wedding, questioning how to keep me from finding out about the delivery, while Ronald provided the logistical instructions for blocking the vendors. Emily had chosen the new color palette, explicitly mocking the idea that I would ever find out the truth. The final message was the most painful one I had ever read. Judith had typed out a sentence that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Samantha's wedding is one afternoon. Emily's 30th is the memory people will talk about. They had viewed my marriage as an inconvenient, temporary annoyance that needed to be pushed aside so they could stage a more memorable performance. Natalie laid the printed transcripts on the mahogany desk in her office. She told me that with this final piece of evidence, their defense was officially dismantled. The court had set the date for mediation, meaning all 3 of them would have to sit in the same room as me, without the ability to hide behind text messages or separate legal filings. My attorney looked at the calendar, her expression serious but encouraging. Almost 6 months had passed since the day the process server stood on my porch, and 9 months had elapsed since the wedding. I had spent that entire time living in the shadow of their theft, documenting every lie and preserving every record, and now the truth was finally ready to be placed in front of them in a room from which they could not retreat. Natalie looked up at me, her eyes steady. Next month, she said, They would have to sit in one room and hear all three of their versions of the story collide with reality. I nodded, feeling a quiet, steady resolve. I had stopped trying to hold the family together months ago, and now I was finally ready to see exactly what would remain once the truth tore them apart. The mediation took place inside a quiet, sterile conference room at a legal firm in Richmond, Virginia, nearly 6 months after the process server had stood on my porch and 9 months after the day of the wedding. The air inside the room felt stiff and dry, smelling faintly of synthetic lemon cleaner and old carpet. I sat across the table from Judith, Ronald, and Emily, who looked significantly smaller and less formidable than they had appeared during the initial months of the smear campaign. My attorney, Natalie Cross, sat beside me, her briefcase open and her files meticulously organized. She leaned over to remind me one last time that a settlement was not an act of forgiveness, but a legally binding resolution that we could enforce in court. I knew exactly what I wanted: full reimbursement for the damages, a formal written correction regarding their lies, and ironclad boundaries for any future contact. Judith began the session by dabbing her eyes with a white linen handkerchief, her voice trembling as she insisted that I had given my verbal permission for all the changes. She refused to look at me, keeping her gaze fixed on the mediator, a neutral third party who sat silently at the head of the table. Natalie did not raise her voice or become emotional. She simply placed the original event contract and the forged worksheet on the table. The documents were silent witnesses to the truth. When Natalie pointed out the signature discrepancies and the explicit delivery instructions that excluded me, Judith began to lose her composure, shifting her focus to blame the event manager, Kelsey, for failing to verify the identity of the person making the changes. My father attempted to interject, his face turning an angry shade of crimson as he claimed he had only been acting as a helpful logistics coordinator for the family. He insisted he had no idea the arch or the cake belonged to my wedding contract. Natalie did not argue with him. She simply tapped a button on her tablet, and the conference room filled with the cold, clear recording of his own voice. The phrase, "Do not call the bride," hung in the air, stripping away every lie he had told during his deposition. Ronald went completely still, his fists clenching on the table, as he finally realized he had been caught by his own arrogance. He glanced over at Judith, his expression hardening into a look of betrayal, and the fragile alliance between them began to show deep, irreparable cracks. Emily was the last one to be confronted. When the mediator asked her to explain the email thread where she demanded the removal of my initials from the cake, she looked down at her hands, her lower lip quivering. She tried to claim she was just a victim of Judith's manipulation, but the group chat transcripts I had collected proved otherwise. Natalie read aloud the specific message where Emily had selected the colors and mocked my chances of finding out the truth. The room grew incredibly quiet. Emily turned to Judith, her voice rising in a sharp, accusatory pitch, demanding to know why her mother had promised that I would never fight back. Judith shrieked back, calling my sister selfish for insisting on the country club birthday party, and for a few minutes, the mediation room turned into a chaotic scene of mutual destruction. The mediator finally silenced them, reminding everyone that their internal disputes were irrelevant to the legal claims at hand. As the chaos subsided, the cold reality of their financial situation settled over the table. Everly Events had already provided a partial refund, and the company had reserved their right to seek indemnity from my parents for the remaining liability. My parents were now facing the cost of the original $28,000 package, the $8,000 in emergency replacements, and the massive legal bills accumulated by all sides. Ronald realized then that his prized antique car, the one he had spent decades polishing in the garage, would have to be sold to meet the payment schedule. Judith's social standing in the church and the community was already in ruins, as the required correction letters had forced her to admit to the local board that I had not, in fact, donated my wedding to Emily. In the final moments of the session, Ronald looked across the table at me, his eyes pleading for a concession. He whispered that he needed help keeping the car, claiming it was the only thing that gave him any sense of belonging to a family. I looked at him, remembering the dozens of times he had chosen his own comfort over my happiness, and asked him if family was supposed to come before a car. He had no answer for me. I signed the settlement documents without a trace of hesitation, closing the file on the months of discovery, the lies, and the emotional exhaustion. I did not offer a hug, I did not offer a smile, and I certainly did not offer a path back into my life. As I walked out of the conference room and into the hallway, Judith reached out, clutching my arm with a desperate, frantic grip. She told me I would regret tearing the family apart, her voice filled with a mixture of malice and genuine confusion. I looked through the glass partition of the room I had just left, watching my father and sister arguing about the sale of the car, and realized they would never understand why I had to walk away. I looked down at Judith and told her quietly that I had finally stopped trying to hold it all together. I walked past her, out the front doors of the building, and into the afternoon sun. I finally understood that I did not need to be the one to save them anymore. Standing in the parking lot, I felt the heavy weight of the last year beginning to lift. Daniel walked toward me, his face softened by a mixture of relief and quiet pride. We did not speak about the parents or the drama as we drove back toward our home. Instead, we talked about the upcoming plans for our 1-year anniversary and the small garden we were starting in our backyard. The silence in the car was no longer stifling. It was peaceful, reclaimed, and entirely ours. My parents were facing a future defined by the consequences of their own choices, while I was finally free to inhabit the life I had built for myself. I arrived at my office the next morning, with the strange awareness that the legal battle was over, but my body had not received the message yet. For months, every vibration of my phone had meant another demand from Natalie, another document to review, or another accusation from my family. Now the screen remained dark beside my keyboard. I opened my digital calendar and deleted the recurring reminders for attorney calls, evidence reviews, and deposition preparation. Empty blocks appeared across the weeks ahead. At first, the blank spaces made me uneasy. I had spent so long organizing my life around their crisis that freedom felt like another task I had forgotten to complete. My work helped. I returned to a supply chain project that had been waiting for my full attention. The numbers followed rules. Every shipment had an origin, a destination, and a person responsible when something went wrong. My family had spent years convincing me that their consequences belonged to everyone, especially me. The settlement had finally placed each responsibility back where it belonged. That afternoon, Aunt Barbara sent me a link to the listing for Ronald's antique car. I stared at the photograph for several seconds. The paint gleamed beneath the garage lights, polished to the same flawless shine I remembered from childhood. My father had protected that car more fiercely than he had protected my wedding day. I closed the message without opening the auction page. Whether the car sold for enough money was no longer my concern. Whether Judith resigned from her community board without creating another version of the story was no longer my concern. Whether Emily blamed our parents, herself, or me was no longer my concern. They had lawyers, payment schedules, and written obligations. They were adults. They could manage the lives they had created. When I came home that evening, Daniel was kneeling beside the small patch of soil behind our townhouse. He had marked out the first rows of the garden we had postponed during the lawsuit. A bag of potting soil rested beside him, and several packets of seeds were spread across the patio table. "You still want tomatoes?" he asked. I looked at the narrow yard, the clean windows, and the life waiting for my attention. For once, there was no emergency hidden behind the question. "Tomatoes," I said, "and maybe rosemary." We worked until the light faded behind the trees. Dirt settled beneath my fingernails, and the muscles in my shoulders loosened with each small task. Nothing about the evening was dramatic. No one apologized. No enemy appeared to witness my happiness. There was only the ordinary work of building something that belonged to us. Later, I sat on the porch with a glass of water while Daniel cleaned the garden tools. My phone remained inside the house. I did not check the family group chat. I did not review the payment schedule. I did not open the folder containing the evidence. For most of my life, peace had meant the brief pause between one family crisis and the next. That evening, I understood it could mean something else. It could mean that no crisis was coming through my door unless I allowed it inside. The dust of the legal battle began to settle, leaving behind a landscape that looked familiar yet entirely transformed. Watching Ronald manage the sale of his antique car felt like witnessing the dismantling of a monument built on hollow ground. He had spent years obsessively polishing that vehicle in the garage, treating the metal and leather with more tenderness than he ever directed toward his own children. The listing eventually appeared on an online auction site, and I watched the final bid close through a link forwarded by Aunt Barbara before she deleted the connection for good. The money went directly toward the installment plan required by the settlement, erasing the last of the emergency replacement costs for my wedding. Ronald retired from his job shortly after, forced to cancel the expensive vacation he had planned for years. He sent a single bitter email accusing me of being the primary reason for his forced frugality, but I simply moved the message into the digital folder labeled Legal Matters and never typed a reply. Judith suffered the most visible collapse within our small social circle. The board members of the community service organization she had led for over a decade formally requested her resignation after Natalie sent the required correction letters to every person she had previously misled. She had built her entire identity on the illusion of being the perfect, selfless mother, and seeing that facade stripped away in front of her neighbors was a weight I knew she would carry for the rest of her life. One of the women she had previously looked down upon reached out to me, offering a sincere apology for believing the initial rumors. I did not take any pleasure in my mother's humiliation, but feeling the truth finally exist outside the confines of my own mind provided a necessary, long overdue relief. Emily faced the most immediate reality of her changed status. Without the constant influx of cash or the family's frantic redirection of assets to ensure her comfort, my sister had to reconcile with her lifestyle. She spent several weeks listing her designer bags and birthday presents on resale websites to cover her portion of the settlement payments. Several local lifestyle partnerships she had maintained for her social media presence ended abruptly when the group chat transcripts became common knowledge, revealing that she had knowingly accepted property that belonged to my wedding contract. The golden child role evaporated the moment she could no longer provide the family with the performance they craved. She and Judith eventually stopped speaking, their relationship fracturing under the stress of who had to sell what to satisfy the creditors. The frantic protection she had enjoyed all her life vanished, leaving her to finally face the world on her own terms. Several weeks after the settlement was signed, I drafted a final letter to be sent through our respective attorneys. The boundaries were clear and entirely non-negotiable. All future communication had to pass through a designated email address. No unannounced visits were permitted. No requests for financial assistance would be acknowledged, and they were strictly forbidden from involving any extended family members in our private affairs. I did not include any heartfelt sentiments or long-winded explanations for why I was doing this. The only thing that mattered was that the cycle of obligation had been severed. Emily replied to the email once, asking if there was any chance for us to start over. I stared at the blinking cursor, feeling the familiar pull of the sister I had once loved and protected. I realized, however, that accountability had to last much longer than the fear of a legal settlement. I sent a brief reply, stating that I was not ready to reopen the door, and that my lack of response was not a sign of temporary anger, but a permanent change in how I lived my life. I did not block them, but I also did not offer them any path back into my world. Months later, Daniel and I finally took the honeymoon we had delayed for nearly a year. We traveled to a quiet, rugged stretch of the Virginia coast, far away from the suburbs of Chesterfield County. The $50,000 military bonus had been deposited into our accounts long before, but I did not treat the money like a windfall or a prize to be flaunted. I placed a significant portion into our retirement savings and used a smaller, calculated sum to fund essential home repairs that had been lingering on our to-do list since we bought the townhouse. I also quietly and without using my name, donated a consistent amount to an emergency fund managed by a veterans group that helped military couples navigate the financial hardships of deployments. Every time I thought about that money, I saw it as a tool for security rather than a bargaining chip for my parents to use. This act of voluntary giving felt entirely different from the forced sacrifices they had demanded of me. I had built the power to choose who received my help, and for the first time, that power belonged to me alone. The contrast between this self-directed kindness and the money they had tried to steal was a sharp, clarifying contrast. On the 1-year anniversary of the wedding, Daniel and I returned to the historic Riverside Mill where the ceremony had occurred. The weather was perfect, the sky a clear, deep blue that mirrored the river running just outside the windows. Grace, the venue coordinator, welcomed us back with a genuine, warm smile, having long ago moved past the chaos of our initial booking. She had prepared a small, simple cake for us, decorated in elegant, understated style, with our initials clearly displayed in the frosting. There were no empty chairs waiting for the people who had tried to erase our day. Our chosen family sat around the table, the same people who had brought supermarket flowers and used their own cameras to ensure we were celebrated even when the world felt like it was falling apart. I looked at the small group of people, the friends who had been my primary support system for years, and felt a deep, steady peace. I reached into my bag and touched the worn blue field notebook that had traveled with me through my training and through the darkest months of the discovery process. It was filled with times, names, and the chronological record of every lie they had told, yet I realized as I sat there that I no longer needed to look at it. The notebook served its purpose as a map of the landscape I had navigated, but I was no longer lost. I tucked it away, knowing it would stay in the desk drawer for the rest of my life, a silent testament to a version of myself I had officially outgrown. Daniel took my hand, his palm warm and steady against mine. We did not speak about the parents or the settlement or the long, arduous road we had walked to arrive at this specific moment. We talked about the garden we were planning for the next spring and the travel plans we had set for the fall. Every word felt light, honest, and entirely devoid of the hidden agendas. I looked out at the river, feeling the cool breeze against my skin. The people who once controlled my life had spent decades trying to build their own legacy upon the foundation of my sacrifices. They had treated my ambitions, my money, and my happiness as a vast, renewable resource that would never run dry. They were completely wrong. The $50,000 never saved my parents, and it certainly did not bring the family together in the way they had once promised. Instead, it served as the cornerstone for the future they had spent my entire life trying to take from me. I own my home, I own my career, and most importantly, I own the right to say no without needing to apologize for it. The struggle had been painful, but the result was a life that was finally, unequivocally mine. I leaned back in my chair, watched the sunlight dance on the surface of the river, and took a deep, satisfied breath, knowing I had absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone. I realized then that, while they were still busy fighting over the scraps of a broken past, I had already started living the future they never believed I deserved. The weight of the last year did not disappear all at once, but it softened into something I could easily carry. The silence in my house, once a source of anxiety, had become the true luxury I fought for. I no longer woke up wondering what disaster was brewing in my mother's kitchen or what kind of role I was expected to play in my sister's manufactured drama. I owned my schedule, my time, and my peace. My career in logistics had taught me that every complex system had a breaking point, and my family had finally reached theirs. It was not a sad ending. It was a necessary reorganization of resources, a clean break that allowed for a much more sustainable operation. Daniel squeezed my hand again, pulling me back to the present moment. I looked at the people around the table, friends who had never asked for anything, people who understood that relationships were built on mutual respect rather than obligation. This was the family I chose, the one I invested in with my time and my energy. We laughed at a story about our early days of dating, and the sound felt genuine. There was no need to perform, no need to maintain a perfect image, and no need to worry about what someone else might think. I understood that my parents might continue to blame me for their own decisions, and they might continue to believe that their fall from grace was my fault. That was their burden to carry, not mine. I had fulfilled my duty as their child, until the moment it became clear that the duty was being used to destroy me. I reached for the cake knife, feeling the cool metal, and looked at Daniel. He smiled, and I knew we were entering the next chapter of our lives, one where I was the primary architect of my own joy. The river continued its steady journey toward the sea, unaffected by the small drama that had played out on its banks. Nature was indifferent to the hurt we had caused and the truth we had uncovered. It simply continued to flow, reminding me that even the most difficult seasons eventually gave way to a new one. I was ready for whatever came next, confident in the boundaries I had set and the life I had created. The $50,000 had been the price of admission to my own adulthood, and looking back, I knew it was the best investment I had ever made. I was finally finished with the project of being their daughter, and I had successfully launched the career of being my own person. Everything that mattered was right in front of me, and everything that had hurt me was safely relegated to the past, where it belonged. If you have spent your life playing the role of the reliable one, the person who absorbs every family crisis, covers for the mistakes of others, and ignores your own exhaustion to keep the peace you need to understand that your capacity for sacrifice is not an infinite resource. You have been taught that family comes first, and perhaps you have even believed that your value as a person is defined by how much you are willing to endure for the sake of appearances. But there is a dangerous point where love, when stripped of boundaries, transforms into a form of self-abandonment that serves no one. True loyalty to yourself means recognizing when you are being treated as a logistical solution rather than a human being. It means accepting that you are not obligated to finance the irresponsibility of others, nor are you required to remain silent while your own life is dismantled to provide a backdrop for someone else's performance. You must realize that the people who benefit from your lack of boundaries will rarely be the ones who respect you for setting them. When you finally stop providing the fuel for their dysfunction, they will be angry, they will be hurt, and they will try to convince you that you are the one responsible for the wreckage left behind. Let them be angry. Let them tell their version of the story to whoever will listen. Protecting your sanity is not an act of selfishness. It is a fundamental act of survival. You are the only person who will live your entire life with you, and building a future that is entirely your own is a pursuit that demands you stop waiting for their approval. Accountability is not the same thing as cruelty, and declining to be someone's crisis manager is not a failure of character. It is the mark of someone who has finally decided to treat their own life with the dignity it deserves. You have the power to define what a healthy relationship looks like, and you possess the right to remove yourself from any system that requires your destruction to function. Stop waiting for the moment they will finally recognize your worth or thank you for your patience, because that moment may never arrive. Instead, look at the people who show up for you consistently, without needing a crisis or a performance to justify their presence. Those are the relationships worth investing your limited energy into. You are the architect of your own peace, and you are entirely capable of launching a future that is not built on the shifting, unstable ground of their expectations. Have you ever found yourself continuing to carry a burden that never belonged to you, simply because you were afraid of what might happen if you finally set it down? I would love to hear how you learned to draw your own lines in the sand. And what was the one moment that finally gave you the courage to choose your own future over the obligation of the past?